Krista Halverson is the director of Shakespeare and Company bookstore's publishing venture. Previously, she was the managing editor of Zoetrope, All Story, the art and literary quarterly published by Francis Ford Coppola, which has won several national magazine awards for fiction and numerous design prizes. She was responsible for the magazine's art direction, working with guest designers including Lou Reed, Kara Walker, Mikhail Baryshnikov, Zaha Hadid, Wim Wenders, and Tom Waits, among others. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thanks for having me.
You edited Shakespeare and Company, A History of the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart, which was published by Shakespeare and Company, the bookstore in Paris, which is quite appropriate.
Yeah, it's the first book that the bookshop has published.
Okay. And where can you find it?
It's available all over, obviously at Shakespeare and Company and at our website where we sell books, but it's also distributed in the States, in Canada, and the UK, and around the world by Artbook, DAP in the States, and by Thames and Hudson everywhere else.
Thames and Hudson, that's a venerable art book venture.
Yes, yeah, we were really happy when they picked us up.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's start early on in the history of the company, or the bookstore. Sylvia Beach, who was she?
Sylvia Beach was an American woman who had come to France in 1917 after the war. And she was living here with her sister, and that year she met a French woman named Adrienne Monnier, who was the first French woman to own her own bookstore, a bookstore called, I always mess this up, it's terrible.
You mean the French pronunciation, or?
Well, no, I'm going to destroy all my French pronunciations. I know your wife is French, and so you will be appalled, and any of your listeners who speak French will be appalled. La Maison des Amis des Livres.
That's pretty good.
Okay,
Yeah.
It's not horrible.
Yeah. No. So wait a minute, she's the first French woman to own a bookstore in France?
Yes, Adrienne Monnier.
So what, women weren't allowed to own bookstores before that?
I imagine had to do with capital. I don't know if the laws had changed at the turn of the century that allowed women to have capital as it did in other countries. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
But so Adrienne Monnier had the first French woman to have a bookstore in France, and
Okay.
It was really quite immediately a salon for all the big French writers at that time.
Right.
Going back to Sylvia Beach, she was just walking around the Latin Quarter, the 6th arrondissement one day, and she happened to pass this bookshop, and she went in and she met Adrienne Monnier, and it seems like there was a great spark between these two women.
Mm-hmm.
And well, Sylvia Beach never said it was a sexual or romantic relationship. I think that's what her biographer, most historians understand, was that it was a love affair between these two women.
Who's the biographer?
Noel Riley Fitch is the most prominent of Beach's biographers.
Okay.
But also a woman named Carrie Walsh edited Sylvia Beach's letters. That came out about 4 years ago,
Okay.
5 years ago. So these two women met, and Sylvia Beach had always wanted to have a bookshop. She had thought of opening a French bookshop in New York, but her mind was changed, either persuaded by Adrienne Monnier or she changed it herself, to have an English language bookshop in Paris. And so Monnier helped Sylvia Beach find a shop not far from her own bookstore, which was on Rue de l'Odéon. They found a spot on a nearby street called Rue des Prytanes.
Okay.
Are you going to correct me?
I would if I could.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. She asked her mother to help her financially, and with that, she opened a bookshop on November 19th, 1919.
Wow, that's significant, that certainly the year.
I mean, we're coming up on
1919.
in what way?
Well, there's some, I think, of the negotiations at the end of World War I. 1919 was a pivotal year. Actually, it's a great book by a Canadian, Margaret Macmillan.
Yeah, I don't know it.
Which won the Governor General's Award some years back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway,
Okay, yeah.
I digress.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
So she opened this bookstore, and
And the anniversary's coming up, a
Yeah.
big one, yeah.
yeah, next November will be the 100th
Yeah.
anniversary. So she was there, and I think because of her relationship with Adrienne Monnier, lots of these well-known established French writers would come to Beach's shop to buy English language books. And around the same time, all these great anglophone expats also found Beach's shop. So right away, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas showed up.
And they just sort of hung out there, did they?
Yeah, I think so. What Monnier had established with her shop, which Beach then reconstructed, was really to have something more of a salon. Not the French-style bookshops, which I understand could be quite, for lack of another word, stuffy, quite formal. They put in couches and reading chairs, and at least in Beach's, there was a cat,
Sure.
So it was a very, in a certain kind of bookshop, there has to be a cat.
Yeah.
So hers was that kind of shop, and she hung on the walls pictures of all the writers who she most admired, number one being Walt Whitman, and the other being William Shakespeare. So not photograph, but an image of William Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. So she invited in a community, basically.
Yeah, and I think at that time, I'm trying to think if there were other English language bookshops in Paris at that time. I don't know. I do believe it was before the American Library opened, but that maybe that had to have come not long.
1920, that was.
Yeah, so not long after, so the next year. But there really, I think you had a lot of expats, Anglophone expats in Paris at that time, and not a place to buy books.
Mm-hmm.
And not this clubby atmosphere that her shop provided. So they also said it was like this great meeting point too between the French writers and the American and the British writers. That was this place where they all came to know one another.
And where did she get the books from? She just sort of import them, or what? Import new books, or how does she do that?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm sure I've read it at some point, but I don't know the answer to that.
So the community that came in there and started hanging out, you mentioned Gertrude Stein. Who else?
Well, Hemingway came before Hemingway was famous. This is still when he was a journalist, a sports journalist for the Canadian newspaper. I can't remember which one. The Toronto Star. And so he started hanging out there.
Or maybe it was a Telegram, sorry, but anyway.
But it's Toronto, yeah. But Beach really, I think both Hemingway and Beach took a quick liking to one another. He said about her...
Was there a sexual thing going on there or not?
No, I don't know. I don't think so. And Hemingway, I think Hemingway was always with a woman.
Yeah.
And I think then he was with Hadley. It was before he had the baby. This is not helpful. The baby whose name was like Bumble something. I don't know.
Okay.
Do you know?
No idea. No. It's okay. We're focusing on the bookstore. We don't care about... well, we do, but okay.
No, and... Beach was known for having, maybe I can just pause really quickly and grab this wonderful quote that Hemingway wrote about Sylvia Beach in A Movable Feast, which is his memoirs of his early days in Paris. He writes about Sylvia Beach. Sylvia had a lively, sharply sculptured face, brown eyes that were as alive as a small animal's and as gay as a young girl's. She was kind, cheerful, and interested, and loved to make jokes and gossip. No one that I ever knew was nicer to me. So she really, as I said, like Hemingway came before he was famous, and he was doing sports writing, and he and his wife, which I'm pretty sure was Hadley at the time, would bring Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier to some of these great, like, boxing events with them. And
not bullfighting in Paris, though.
No bullfighting in Paris. I think they went to... what is it where you ride the bikes around in circles? A velodrome? I think there's a big velodrome in Paris at that time, and a lot of boxing matches. Okay. But Hemingway, young Hemingway, was still young Hemingway. When his first book came out, he got a bad review from, I'm forgetting the name of the man, but somebody who hung out a lot at Beach's. And he came into the bookshop in the Shakespeare and Company to complain about this review he got, and he got himself so worked up, and Beach had this huge bouquet of tulips that he ended up just punching this vase, and the tulips and everything went everywhere. But anyway, I think she really encouraged him.
But he didn't punch the reviewer, though. He
didn't. No, but there was another... You'll have to delete this because I can't remember the story exactly, but there was a real tough guy writer who also hung out at the bookshop.
Yeah, Callahan. Morley Callahan.
As this and Beach.
He's a Canadian, and they had a boxing
Yeah,
match.
exactly. And I think Beach took credit in her memoirs, which came out in 1958, of really having set up this fight. This fight between the two.
There's a little Canadian content there. That's
Yeah.
always good. Okay, so what did she? So as her goal, what did she have as a goal? Do you think, with the shop?
Well, my impression about Beach, which is the same as George Whitman's, who founded the current Shakespeare and Company, which we'll get to, is I think the two of them just loved writers. George would say that, or maybe Sylvia Beach would say about herself, that she was just Shakespeare's errand boy. And I think that's how George saw himself too, and what their role was in the literary world was really to facilitate writers in the ways that one can to make the writers' lives easier and to hold up their books. And holding up their books also meant putting their books in contact with readers.
That's what publishers do. I mean, they want to bring attention to great talent.
Mm-hmm. And I think for both of them, Beach would get, people would just come to France and wouldn't necessarily have a permanent address, so she encouraged people to use the bookshop's address as their mailing address. So, it was part post office. She would lend them money when they needed to. We'll get to James Joyce. I mean, she essentially gave him an extraordinary amount of money at her own cost. And she was, this great cheerleader for these writers. Like I was just saying about Hemingway coming in. I mean, I think she was that sort of best friend that year for one to talk about his or her career and their writing. And I think she was endlessly positive and encouraging. And I think there's something, too, when the person in that role, this is true for a lot of editors and publishers, when they're not writers themselves, and it removes that competition, I think that underlies a lot of relationships between writers. Yeah.
Okay, so we got Hemingway. Anyone else?
Juno Barnes spent quite a bit of time. Again, like the French writers, like Louis.
She was famous lesbian, right?
Yeah, she wrote Nightwood as her most famous book.
I've got a first edition of that.
Oh, extraordinary.
New Directions. It's kind of a purple and black and white cover. Could be by Alvin Lustig.
How extraordinary. Where did you come by that?
You know where? It was Flagstaff.
Really?
Arizona. Yeah. Can't remember the name of the bookstore.
Did they know what they had, or?
Yeah, I think they did. I think it was like $35, $40.
Oh, that's not bad. That's nice. What a nice book.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah.
I'm just gonna look at my little notes / read my own book is my. I was looking through it this morning. I was like, how sad that my brushing up for an interview is reading my own book. So with who else came to the bookshop? There was the French, as I mentioned, like André Marot, Jules Romain, Louis Aragon, and also T.H. Lawrence, Ezra Pound, Thornton Wilder. Wow. After, which we'll get to, I'm sure, after Sylvia Beach published, she was the first publisher of James Joyce's Ulysses, Anais Nin and Henry Miller came to the bookshop asking her if she would publish Tropic of Cancer, which she said no. She always said she was a one-book or one-author publishing house.
Okay.
And the Fitzgeralds both hung out there as well.
Okay, that's pretty good company to keep. Okay, so this is the early 20s then?
Yeah.
So when does Joyce show up on the scene?
Really soon after Beach opened her shop. Okay. She met him at a luncheon at a French author, Andres, I don't know if you say Spire or Spier, S-P-I-R-E. She met him. Joyce was also at this luncheon, and they were eating, and Andre Spear's dog came in and was barking, and it turns out that, Joyce, I think, somewhat famously, is very scared of dogs, and got up quite quickly, excused himself from his table, and went into a back room. And Beach followed him and started talking to him, and he quite quickly was telling her how upset he was over the fate of Ulysses. He had been writing the book, in these famous chapters, and the chapters individually had been appearing in literary journals in the U.S. and the UK.
That Weaver?
No, Harriet Weaver was his sponsor.
Later on? Okay.
Yeah, it was, I should know their names. It's a little review in the States, which was run by two women, I mean, it's really
very courageous.
And I think what I'll just say, as we tell this story, you just see there's so many women. We talk about these great men, expat male writers of the 20s,
Yes.
plus Gertrude Stein, that's kind of our conversation. But behind this, it's just almost all of Joyce's sponsors, financial sponsors, were women.
Yeah.
With maybe the exception of, I think his name is John Quinn. But the women who were publishing these little magazines, these little journals, were mostly women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was they who, in the States, and I do wish I could remember their name, there's two women who published a little review.
I'll put it into my little notes for the show.
Great. Yes, so they were the ones who were taken to trial in an obscenity case.
Mm.
So essentially both the U.S. and the U.K.'s government had already deemed portions of Ulysses to be obscene. And in that way, no one in the U.S. or the U.K. would bring out the complete book because they already knew this is going to be embargoed and it's going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And the chances of making money off it are small, and the chances of being sued and having to pay legal fees are very high. So this is when Beach meets Joyce at this luncheon. He's telling her this story, and she says to him, well, perhaps Shakespeare and Company, which is not published anything, has probably been open for a year at this point, perhaps Shakespeare and Company could bring it out. And he comes to see the shop, the next day, and he agrees to let Sylvia Beach bring out this book, which she does. So he's working on the manuscript, and people are typing it up. There's a quite funny story about a woman who's typing up the manuscript, and her husband came home and started reading it and was so upset by it he threw it at the manuscript in the fire.
Wonder if it was the masturbation scene.
I don't know. I've not read it.
Okay.
I'm just going to admit that now.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're here again to talk about the bookstore,
yeah.
So not to worry.
So, not to talk about, masturbation scene in Ulysses. Good. So Beach finds a printer in Dijon who is going to print this book, a printer that, fortunately does not speak English, and so they don't understand exactly what they're publishing. They're sending back proofs.
No wonder it's so difficult to read.
I know. Well, and then there's this. So Beach gives the proofs to Joyce, who then proceeds to make an incredible amount of changes. To Beach's estimate, changes up to a third of Ulysses, both by striking things and adding things and moving things around, all in the proofs, which are then going back to Dijon to also, again, these not English speakers, so they don't know what they're publishing, but also they're having to enter all these corrections in old typesetting, which I'm sure the mistakes in that those first editions, that's really charming.
Famous line is that it's kept the scholars busy for centuries.
Which is
the book. So not only are they worrying about exactly what the accurate text is, but then once they've got that, then they have to
start all over too, probably once that came out. Yeah, I wonder when it got really cleaned up. There was the Random House, wasn't it Random House that was the first big publisher in the States who brought it out? Yeah,
there was an interesting article in the New Yorker just recently about this slightly crazed professor who's ended up in Brazil.
Is this about the missing Joyce scholar?
Yeah.
That was in the Times. Yeah, I printed out, I haven't read it yet.
Is that in the Times? I thought it was in the New Yorker.
I think it's in the Times.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to read it.
Yeah,
I think it's fascinating.
Right. Yeah, it is fascinating, yeah. Although, this is interesting. I spoke with someone who had dealt with this guy and had started to use some of his changes in an edition that they put out. He said he was one of the hardest people he's ever dealt with, one of the most unpleasant people he's ever dealt with. So this article kind of champions the scholar in Brazil. Maybe not the nicest person around.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're getting off topic again.
No, it's okay.
So do you know how many copies she had printed off for the first
I think it was
edition?
just 1,000.
Just 1,000.
And she was able to fund it. So they were working on it through 1921. She was able to fund it by pre-selling it through subscription.
Oh, okay.
And
so she sold that out, did she, or?
I couldn't say with 100% certainty, but I would assume so.
She raised enough to cover her cost, though.
Yeah, which we maybe covered her cost, but to raise revenue for it.
Sure.
I think, in terms of her making money, I don't think she made money on it. I think she was financially supporting Joyce quite a bit. Like, he would just come in and
she'd give
ask
him
for money.
advances,
And so I think there was a lot of advances.
Okay.
And I would imagine all the changes he was making, too, to the proofs were adding to her costs. But, you know, she really never complained about that. I think it was people around her who would comment on
But he was
the
taking
financial
advantage of her, maybe?
Well, just
or?
maybe I think he took advantage of everyone. It's
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
my perception of Joyce.
Yep.
But the financial sacrifices that she made to bring out Ulysses. But she wrote in her memoir that, you know, the joy for her was bringing out the book. Like, that was the reward she wanted, not financial success. It certainly made her bookshop more well-known, you know, past the immediate literary expat circles. I think, you know, by the time the 30s come, there were, like, American Express tourist buses going past and pointing out the shop. It was then a literary destination in its time, and, you know, within a decade of having published Ulysses.
So what happened with those books? How did she distribute them?
You know, so they were worried about these embargoes because of, you know, it being obscene.
That's right. I know they couldn't get them into the States. And then, there's an interesting story about how Hemingway knew some guy in
Canada.
Windsor, Ontario, exactly, who smuggled them across on the ferry.
Yeah, so Beach successfully, so I'll just backtrack quick. The book came out on February 22nd, 1922. I have to double check. Hold on, I'm going to say it again to you.
Yeah.
So the book came out on February 2nd, 1922, which was Joyce's birthday. And by come out, I just mean Beach that morning received 2 copies, copy number 1 and copy number 2. And, you know,
From Dijon.
From Dijon.
Okay.
Those came on the train, the first the 7 a.m. express from Dijon. And she went and met the conductor and got the book and went straight to Joyce's to give him this copy number 1 on his birthday. I think he was quite a superstitious man, and he liked a harmony of, you know, the book arriving on his birthday.
I'm trying to remember the color of the cover. Is it kind of a teal or a green? What is it?
It's to be the same blue as the Greek flag. I think they spent also with the printers quite a bit of time trying to get just the right color blue.
Okay, and it was a soft cover. They put the cover on it.
Cover.
Which is not that usual in France. So they don't typically put a cover on it for French books, but for English books,
for this
obviously
one,
they do. Yeah. So that's interesting. And were they numbered or not?
I do believe they are numbered. That's my impression.
Right. So again, she had them obviously for sale in the bookstore.
Well, the other ones went to the subscribers, and she writes in her memoir that she got all of the copies to subscribers in England there and in their hands successfully without incident.
How did she do that?
Just by shipping them.
Just putting one by one?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay.
But the copies that she sent into the States were stopped and weren't allowed to go through and didn't meet their customers. Okay. So she then, and you I think know this story, about Hemingway's great idea of how she can get copies into the States, which was to send the books to a friend of his in what town?
Windsor.
In Windsor, Ontario. Yeah. And that he would then get on a ferry and travel by ferry, you know, with just a couple books each trip, down in his... To
Detroit, Yeah, it's cool.
So that's how, in her words, she penetrated the U.S.
Right. Okay. So that really put her on the map. And so she continued to sort of serve as a sort of a community center for writers and supplying English language books to anyone who wanted to buy them in Paris. Yeah. And that went on for
20 more years.
20 more years.
Yeah, she closed in 41, so it's 20 years. She brought out more editions of Ulysses during that time. And she was also the publisher of Joyce's poetry, a book called Poems Penny Each.
Okay.
And one other book, I should know the name offhand, but I don't. It's a book about Finnegan's Wake, and it was essays written by, do you know what I'm talking?
Yeah, is it a skeleton guide or not? Not that one.
I think that's the name.
Because that's Joseph Campbell, I think.
Yeah, this is, it's like 31, 32, and it was other quite famous writers of that time writing about Finnegan's Wake.
Okay. No, I don't know.
It's a long title. I can't think of work.
Okay.
But she was just interested in Joyce. Other people had tried to... like I said about Henry Miller, and also D.H. Lawrence tried to persuade her to bring out Lady Chatterley's Lover, which she also declined.
She kept on good terms with Joyce then?
I think yes, for the most part. Again, as much as anybody was staying on good terms with Joyce.
Joyce, he moved around a fair amount. Did he go to Zurich after that?
Yeah, he went to Zurich after, which is where he died, isn't it? I mean, when did he die? Like 32, 34?
A bit later than that, and during the war. Okay, so...
So you can go on to the book's closing.
The what?
The Shakespeare and Company, Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company.
That's right. It closes in 41 because of the war, right?
Yeah.
And then what happens? What does she do?
She stays in Paris. So her bookshop closes in December 1941, and I'll just tell this, I think, quite well-known story about, well-known to people who know Beach and who know Joyce, about how the bookshop closed. And it was after the occupation of Paris by the Nazis, and a Nazi officer had come by her shop, and she had a copy of Finnegan's Wake in the window. And the officer came into the shop and said, "I want to buy that." And Beach refused to sell it to him. And he said, "Why?" And she says, "It's my last copy and it's mine." And he says, "You either sell me this book or I'm coming back later this afternoon with my cohorts and we're going to shut down your shop." And she said, "It's not for sale." And so he left angry. She shut the door and called her friends, and they themselves closed down the bookshop that day. Beach had an apartment above the shop, I think on the 3rd floor, and so they moved all of the books from the shop up into her apartment, and her bookstore never reopened.
Where is that show? You said that it's, what is it now?
It's,
clothing store or something?
It's a clothing store. So that's on Rue de l'Odéon. So she started on Rue d'Ébritin, and then a year and a half after that, a space became available opposite Adrienne Monnier's bookshop. Okay. And so then that's on Rue de l'Odéon, and that's where she moved. And that's the space that's really associated with Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company.
And there's a plaque there now, is there, or something?
There is a plaque, but it wasn't put up by the city of Paris, interestingly. It was put up, I think, really led by a writer named John Baxter, who writes a lot about Paris and Paris history.
He does tours, doesn't he, too?
I think so.
Yeah.
And he lives in that building where Sylvia Beach had her apartment. Okay. And I think he's campaigned the mairie, which is like the city hall for the arrondissement, to put up a plaque, because there's hundreds of plaques all over Paris where famous writers and poets have lived, and publishers. And in the end, he worked, I think, with friends of his own to put up this plaque. Okay. Which is too bad. The mairie should really put up a plaque for Sylvia Beach.
Just because she's English, maybe, or what?
I don't know. I do think there's one across the street for Adrienne Monnier. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. How far away from the current store, the Shakespeare and Company store,
is that? It's about a 10-minute walk.
Okay, so she closes it down and then just sort of lives here?
Yeah, she stayed in Paris in that same apartment until her death in 1962.
And what did she do? She write?
No, I think she stayed quite involved with literary Paris. She was really great friends with Loran Stosskopf, who came in the 50s and was a very big writer with his Alexandria Quartet at that time. Yeah. And also with Richard Wright, who came late 40s, early 50s, and lived quite near her on Rue Monsieur Le Prince. And she was great friends with both of them, which is how she ends up meeting George Whitman, who founded this shop. Because George was also good friends with Loran Stosskopf and Richard Wright. So I think that's was their first and strongest connection.
So, good. So George sets up his own bookstore in 51?
In 51. So George Whitman was an American. He served in World War II, stationed primarily in Greenland at at a weather post.
A lot of Germans up there?
You know, there weren't, but at that time, I should say, there were Germans, not a lot of Germans. It was believed that, and maybe this is true, that from Greenland they could see what the weather was going to be as it came down across the European front. Mm-hmm. And so they had these weather stations there so they could predict what the weather patterns were going to be, so that they could then strategize on like the best way to move forward on the front.
It sounds totally harebrained.
thinking that that's not true, but
Yeah, well, it might be true.
I mean, not true that one could.
Just today, how ridiculously inaccurate weathermen are.
Yeah.
But anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So he's up
Well, I think
there.
they've always been inaccurate. We just all know it more because we're walking around with a weatherman in our pocket and in our phone. So we can look at it saying it's going to be 85. Well, we stand in the rain in 62.
Okay, so he was up there. That's where he did most of his
his service. And then he went, he was in Massachusetts, and that's where he started his first bookshop in Trenton, Massachusetts. And he had that bookshop for a year, and then...
Used bookstore or new?
I assume it was all used books.
Okay.
I said Trenton, excuse me, it was Taunton.
Taunton, okay,
Massachusetts. Good. So then he had that bookshop, and then as he was relieved, had served his 4 years and no longer was serving, he started planning his trip to Paris. So he came here in August 1946. And
he just wanted to travel, I guess, did he?
I think so, and
he was pretty young, was he? How old was he?
So he was born in 1912, so it's like 20s.
When did he travel again?
So I was in 46. Sometimes I can't do
so
math.
he's
It's just like 34, yeah. So he came in 46. But I think George always wanted to have a bookshop. And, he had this one in Taunton, and he came here, and he was here on the GI Bill, and studying at the Sorbonne, and living in this student housing called Cité Universitaire, which is still there today. And he...
Just like a dorm?
I think it's just a big swath of student housing, and that's my impression of it. So he was there, and because he was on the GI Bill, he was getting rations to buy to buy food and all sorts of things, and they had book rations. And so George would trade his food rations with other GIs for their book rations. And so as soon as he arrived, he started accumulating a library of English language books, which otherwise would have been quite expensive to come by at that time. And again, I assume because it's right after the war, these are used books. But so he then had his room at Cité Universitaire, and he said he would just leave the door open so people could come in and out and borrow the books and return his books. From there, he moves on to a rooming place on Boulevard Saint-Michel called the Hôtel Suez, where he had a small windowless room, and it was the same thing.
Like Marcel Proust, then.
Was it a small windowless room?
Yeah, I think so.
I've also not read Proust. You're just going to out me for everything I've not read.
You didn't have to tell me that, but okay.
Well, I'm not one to fake it.
No,
It's
good.
awkward when someone does that. It's evident. It's always evident.
It's famous. Proust is famous for having a cork-lined room.
Oh, I did know.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize there were no windows.
Well, you never, there could have been windows, but my sense is that there wasn't.
Okay.
But that's another thing we'll have to...
Yeah, I'll have to look up.
Check that out. Okay. So he had a small windowless room.
Yeah, and he called it the old smoky reading room because George, chain smoked for much of his life until then he quit and became, militant about not smoking. But he would then...
And lived to 98.
And lived till 98.
Okay.
So he had this room, and again would just leave the door open so people would come in and out. And this is how he meets what he would call his oldest friend that he would have was Lawrence Ferlinghetti, then called Lawrence Ferling. Lawrence Ferlinghetti had dated George's sister Mary in school in New York at Columbia. They had met one another. And George's sister Mary had given Ferlinghetti a letter of introduction to George, and so Ferlinghetti just shows up at this room one day and meets George, and I'm pausing because I was going to say, and they hit it off, but, I don't think George was a great eccentric, I don't think he's someone who's quite hitting it off with people, but I think they found a like-minded man in one another, somebody who was devoted to reading and writers and the literary life.
And to books, too, obviously,
to books.
To the acquisition of books, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think, and Ferlinghetti said, George had this incredible library of books that nobody else, there was no, library that was free and that one could just come in and...
Wasn't there the American...
Yeah, but I don't think was it free?
I don't know.
I don't think so.
Okay.
We'd have to double check. I
Yeah.
don't want to say that
No, okay.
that it cost a bunch of money.
Your impression
My
is
impression is that it wasn't
you had to pay.
free.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's how we met. And when I went through, after George had passed away, I was the person who sorted through his archives. I found a postcard from 1958 from Ferlinghetti sent to George, or a note left to George, asking him, if he had these books, and if so, that Ferlinghetti was going to come and get them.
What do you mean? He was going to go all the way from San Francisco?
No, he was here.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. That would be impressive. Good reason for a trip to France.
Okay. I'll cut that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, leave it in.
Okay, so I'll go get the books, and they sort of hit it off as best they could. Why are we talking about?
We're talking about the places George lived. And so
Yeah.
by this time, as we're getting to the late 40s, George has accumulated, probably he's getting up to like 1,000 books of his own in his own collection, and running this informal lending library.
That's very decent of him, too. I don't like to lend my books out because I
Yeah.
figure it's hard to get them back.
Yeah.
He obviously was...
I think
had
they were
an
always
open-
hard to get them back.
Right.
I think George was a bit of, I pause to use a word I don't think he would use, but like a bit of a spiritualist about like putting the right person in contact with the right book.
Okay, to change their life, yeah.
Yeah, and I just think throughout his life and having this bookshop, people would come in and he would meet them and say, "You've got to read this," and sort of insist that the person have the book, to the point of like not charging them for the book.
Putting the book in their hands and...
Just insisting that it was
yeah.
for them to read.
So wait a sec. So it was an informal lending library that then morphed into something, right?
Sort of. So he had this place in his room. It was just in his room
Yeah.
on Boulevard Saint-Michel. And then he's always was looking for years to find a space. And when he found, where the shop is right now at 37 Rue de la Boucherie, he said, then he knew, this was the space that he had been waiting for, and was able to purchase it. It was, the equivalent of $500 American dollars neighborhood. Wasn't the bustling central Paris that it is now, and certainly not a touristic neighborhood.
Isn't this where all the roads in Paris start from, ground zero?
It's right across the street, right in front of Notre Dame. It's kilometer zero.
Yeah.
The point at which all roads in France begin. And that is, it's moving in a radius out of the kilometer marker that you'll see on every road. And so kilometer zero, where the counting starts, is right in front of Notre Dame. You can walk through, there's a plaque on the ground, and you can stand in this space.
Right.
So, yeah, George, we are in kilometer zero
Yeah,
here at the bookshop.
But at that point, it was kind of divey then.
Yeah, George used the term slum, but it was primarily an immigrant community still in this area. I think it was primarily a lot of Algerians in this area. It would abut the Latin Quarter, which would be a lot of students. So, small rooms, lots of people smushed into small spaces. So really lively, but, certainly was not a bonne adresse. It was not a wealthy neighborhood at that point.
So he found the place. That must have been a happy day for him.
So it had been a grocery store owned by an Algerian man, and who wanted to move his family to the countryside. So George bought the space from him. And the space that he bought, the bookshop has expanded so much since then. So if someone knows the shop or comes in, you can see it a little bit. You have to use your imagination to imagine the original space, which was, just the ground floor and just the right side of the shop. So I think it's no more than 16 feet across, 12 or 16 feet across, running railroad style, from the front windows. There's one room and then a second room, and third room, railroad style, no windows other than this front window. And also there was no electricity at the time. So everything was done by candlelight, which, if you know Paris in the winter, nighttime comes 4:15. So, and George loved to cook for people too, so he had this can of sterno, which is how do you explain this sterno? It's like a camping, like a camping fire. And so he would put that on. He had a desk made out of old suitcases, and he'd get this little sterno going and put a big pot on top of it, and start making stew. George loved to cook for people. I guess I'll just say, like, the quality of the ingredients,
Okay.
I think some people have found wanting over the years. In the 50s, George had a dog who they called François Villon, which was after his famous French poet, who, I think from, like, the mid-1500s, and he was both this great poet and this, like, great thief who was constantly in and out of prison and who lived in this neighborhood, like, really directly, like, right where the bookshop is. And George had named his dog François Villon, and in part because, according to one person, George had taught the dog to beg for meat scraps at the butcher's. So the dog would go beg for these meat scraps and bring them back to George, and then George would be able to make his beef stew for the night. Yeah.
That's a true story?
According to one person, yeah.
Okay. Who's that one person?
So that was according to a woman whose name is Claire Cahane, and she lived, which I'm sure we'll get to, she lived in the Beat Hotel in the 1950s, and lots of residents of the Beat Hotel, so named because that's where Ginsberg lives, Corso, William Burroughs, otherwise no-name hotel about 5 minutes from here. A lot of the residents of the Beat Hotel hung out here in the 50s.
Wow, that's a story of deprivation, but resourcefulness.
I think
too.
it's resourcefulness.
Yeah.
I mean, I think George was a very, very canny, very resourceful, very thrifty, but I think, for myself, who had grandparents who were from the era of the Great Depression, I do think that just really, for most people, that just really permanently changes the way that one sees resources.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine's father, he can't go to the supermarket without buying 6 boxes of cereal and bringing them home and storing them.
Yeah, and it manifests. My grandfather's best friend, when he was up and more agile, would drive along the interstates of outside Minneapolis, St. Paul, in his van, and he would see things on the road and would just stop to get them. One day it was a huge pile of rags, and he just couldn't believe somebody had thrown out this pile of rags because you just had to wash them, and then you had fold them, and then you had this nice supply of rags.
Speaking of rags, that's your subtitle for this book, The History of the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart. That's Yeats.
That's right, from The Circus Animal's Desertion.
Why did you entitle the book that?
The Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart is how George started referring to the shop in the late 50s, early 60s. In letters, he would make little flyers or advertisements, and he was always referring to it as the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart.
Okay, so we go through the 50s. Again, you're painting a picture of a man who's very, I think, seems to me, altruistic.
Yeah, I mean, well, what I'll say, because we can say with confidence, is, Lawrence Ferlinghetti called George Whitman the most eccentric man he'd ever met. I would think Lawrence Ferlinghetti, knows eccentrics. So to be the most, to me, seems quite striking.
Yeah, but what does that mean? What does eccentric mean? How did he live that?
I mean, he opened up, since the bookshop opened, George has had free beds in the shop that strangers have been invited to come and live in the bookstore. And, we estimate since the bookshop opened, more than 30,000 people have stayed in the bookstore. I mean, that to me, it's like, I don't want a house guest for longer than 2 nights. So here's a man who let 30,000 people into what is, for all purposes, his home.
And his business.
Yeah, and there's just always an incredible trust on offer in the shop.
I don't know if that's eccentric, though.
To me, it's quite particular. It's quite, but that's quite, some good-hearted people. Like none of them have strangers living in their house. I mean, it's very specific. So I think there's that, and then it was mixed with, and I didn't know George, I should say. I came to the shop just a few months after he'd had a stroke, and a few months before he passed away. And so I didn't meet him.
When was that?
I came in the end of 2011. So I don't want to speak as if I'm somebody who knows George personally, but I having read all of his journals and letters, and having spoken to his family and so many of his friends, I do feel like I have a great sense of him.
Who he was,
Yeah. But, George, to meet George wasn't to meet, like, a friendly, benevolent, altruistic person. I mean, he was fiery, he could be stubborn, he could be warm and inviting one moment, and then
mercurial.
the angry and the next second. And I think for a lot of people that added to his charm, but it was a certain kind of person who could stay with George. I think he did offend a lot of people or confuse people by how he acted. Ferlinghetti said about him.
And Ferlinghetti's still alive, isn't he?
He is still alive. Yeah. It's amazing. Ferlinghetti said about George after he'd passed away that he was George's oldest, that George was his oldest friend, and that he'd known him the longest of anyone he knew who's still alive, but that in all their correspondence, there was always a formality how George would interact with him. And Ferlinghetti stated when he came to Paris, he would stay in the bookshop and they would spend this time together. But George wasn't, I think, he wasn't a warm teddy bear kind of guy.
Prickly, perhaps, a bit.
But not always, like mercurial, as you said. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't called Shakespeare and Company until 58?
64.
64.
So the first name was La Mistral, which was named, I think, after one of George's girlfriends, who was herself named after the winds off the Mediterranean, and also after Gabriela Mistral, who was a Chilean poet.
Did George married?
No.
Never married?
No, he married Sylvia's mom in the 80s.
Oh, that late?
Yeah.
Okay.
But he didn't marry his younger man. So he had this bookshop, La Mistral, and Sylvia Beach, who had Shakespeare and Company, as I said, through friends, mostly through Loran Stosskopf and Richard Wright, had started coming to the shop and buying books and had come to know George. And we don't have record of this, as we understand, from a man named Clive Hart, who's a Joyce scholar who was at the shop at the time. In 1958, there was a party for James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity, who had just moved to Paris, a party hosted by George. And Sylvia Beach also came to this party. And she gave a little speech and said that she considered this bookshop, George's bookshop, the spiritual successor to her own, and would give him the name Shakespeare and Company. So according to the New York Times, this is what I know, according to the New York Times, there was a plaque after that went up that said Shakespeare and Company, that Sylvia Beach had given George, and George had put in the window of this bookshop. But he didn't change the name until 1964, which was, and we were just discussing this, the 400th anniversary of William Shakespeare's birth.
Very good. Let's just spend a little bit of time on the book. It's beautiful. It's like, as I was saying, it's kind of like a beautiful, very professional scrapbook of all of the stuff that you came across in your research. Would that be accurate?
It is. We started working on this right after George passed away. And so he had 100 years worth of papers and letters and photographs, and all the people who stay in the bookshop are asked to leave a one-page autobiography, so all of that, and just everything that George had collected over almost 100 years. And it hadn't ever been put into, well, some people, the Tumbleweed bios were pretty much in order.
What do you mean 100 years? He didn't.
He lived to
98.
98,
and he wasn't collecting stuff until.
Well, the oldest thing I found in there was his baby book with his mother had made him with the locks of his baby hair.
Almost 100 years.
Yeah.
Then. Okay.
And letters that he had sent back to his parents when he was sent away to camp when he was 8. It really was an extraordinary archive. All his journals and letters when he traveled after college. And before he served in the war. So it was really just everything. And it took me almost 2 years to go through all the papers and put them into chronological order and to read everything that was there and to see what we have George's, what we had at the shops, all the guest books from the shops, with signatures from famous writers who'd come through. So that was the first step, and it really was an extraordinary experience getting to meet the shop that way, because it felt like the shop was telling me its story. as opposed to other ways that we encounter things. It's already been interpreted for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think which is what I wanted to avoid doing with the book, was overly interpreting for the reader what the shop was. I wanted the reader to be able to form her own feelings about the shop and what it meant, because it is a history and it's a collection of dates and facts and famous names. But I think the reason people keep coming back to Shakespeare and Company is more because of the feeling that they have here. It moves something personal in them, whether through nostalgia or emotions they might have now or ambitions they might have for a life that they want to lead. It really touches something in people. So I wanted
because it's much more than a bookshop.
It is. And so I wanted the book to reflect that openness and to let there be room for the reader to bring himself or herself to the space in the same way that you bring your own self into the shop when you walk through the doors. You don't walk through the shop with a tour guide telling you what to
I did.
You did, yeah.
I'm special.
Yeah. But you'd been here before on your own, too.
I had, yeah.
So I wanted the book to work in that way. At the same time, for people who own the shop now, which is George's only child, Sylvia Whitman, and her husband, David Delaney, we did want to also have a book that establishes the facts and the history of Shakespeare and Company,
mm-hmm.
and that could be a primary resource in understanding the bookstore and how it moved through time, how it interacted with Parisian history, with the expat communities here. So the book does that. And the way that I did this was, like as you said, to have both a scrapbook effect of photographs and archival pieces that just stand on their own. And then I also collected, we have about 70 first-person stories from people who've been through the shop, poems from people who are in the shop or about the shop. And then I've written, I don't know, maybe 30,000 words that run through all of that then give this much more straightforward, fact-based history of the shop.
Is all your stuff in pink? Or is that just me looking at your stuff?
Yeah, my introduction is in
Lovely.
pink.
I like that.
It's pretty, isn't it? We had worked with a really gifted designer. I mean,
Who's the designer?
His name is Loran Stosskopf. He's French. Loran
Stosskopf?
Yes.
And is he independent?
He is, yeah.
Okay.
Paris-based.
How'd you find him?
I just did a ton of looking to find designers, and we did send the project out. I really had it in my head that all of these things had to be mixed together, and I have a design background. So as I was thinking about the book, I did have in mind what the presentation would be. It was really important to me that it not be just all the Tumbleweed bios together, all my text together, all the photos together. I really wanted it to be much more impressionistic, something that would be much more active for the reader. And of course then, but it not to be overly complicated. I can hear myself talking. I think one would imagine just a mess of a book. So we did need to have a really great designer who could bring an almost like mathematical precision to how these things would fall together.
It looks like a really cool, really trendy, I'm thinking of Granta, but mm-hmm. That's the look of it a bit.
Yeah.
Magazine, yeah. Huh.
Yes, we had found some designers, and we'd asked people to do sample designs, and Laurent was really he's a very precise.
Well, you're very well organized, so you obviously hit it off.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I say we knew what we wanted.
You tell me you are. I haven't seen any evidence of it, but.
Well, you're holding it in your hand.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, I love the way you've got these bold colors, pages throughout, reds and brilliant orange and yellow, and it's lovely. Yeah, it's quite a book, and itself, well, the book, the store published the book.
Yes.
So who did you use to make the book?
We're on our second printing. The first printing was done in Belgium by a great printer called Snell. And then for the second printing, we just found a really lovely, lovely printer here in France, in the south of France, called Character.
Sorry?
Character, art and character. This is me saying
art and
character with a French accent.
Very good, very good.
Character.
Yeah.
In the south of France. And
Why did you move?
we just got a better deal.
Okay. Better deal is good.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was really the reason. Both
Sure.
printers were really wonderful, but
What did you send them? Did you give them all the whole thing was just laid out and sent to the printer?
Yeah, you
by
just
the
send
designer,
high-res,
by
yeah.
Loran.
yeah, just high-res PDFs.
Okay.
And then we went when we went to the printing and did all the color correction and color matching.
And so both of these printers are known for being good book, like they did the binding and everything.
I think they send out the binding.
They sent it out, but they took the whole project.
Yeah.
Well, now it's time to look at today. You've got a thriving cafe right next door that George apparently always coveted.
He'd always wanted a cafe there.
Now it's reality.
Yeah. Since 2015. So George had always wanted to open a cafe. He'd also always wanted to expand the bookshop. The last time the bookshop had expanded was 1981. And now we're here in central Paris. It's become a more touristic neighborhood. The places opening up around here and the ability to expand the bookshop, which means an adjoining space. It's rare, you can't just make that happen. You can, so the shop today, as I said, is owned by Sylvia and David. Lucky for them, and also poor things, suddenly within 2 years, all these abutting spaces opened up around the bookshop. So it has expanded quite quickly in the last, in quite a few spaces in the last 2 years.
And it really is labyrinth-like, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. But really sort of expanded that quickly out of just being pragmatic. It was like, this is your chance to take this space if you want it. Otherwise, you might be waiting another 75 years. So the corner space George always wanted for the cafe became available. And so they got that, which was also really quite nice because there was one other group that had their eyes set on it. It was a chain ice cream shop.
Oh,
so,
no.
So we're really quite happy with that.
For sure.
That it's this cafe.
Yeah.
But really, when I was going through the archives, I found drawings dating back from 1965 that George had done of what the exterior, the facade of the shop was going to look like once he had this cafe space.
Mm-hmm.
So they expanded in the cafe, and then we have a couple new rooms too in the bookshop. One, an expanded children's section, which is on the ground floor. The children's section used to be what the French call the first floor, that Americans call the second floor, and Canadians call the second floor too. Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, okay. I thought you were Canadian.
Yeah, but I don't. I don't know what is.
What's standardized.
Sorry, I need to focus you because I was listening to those bells and I was saying, I've got to see. I'm not even listening to you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing exactly what an interviewer shouldn't do, which is to think about their next question.
Oh, yeah, it's
while
okay.
you're talking.
Well, I'm rambling about floors, so.
Well, yeah. So we're both to blame. But of course, you're right next to Notre Dame Cathedral, just so people know. And there's a lovely little patio out front with used books and etc. So, for those who don't know. So, what was your question about the second floor?
I was just saying. Oh, it doesn't matter.
No, it does. I need to
I was just saying that in the States, in France we call the first floor. In the States, they call the second floor.
Because it's one up from the ground floor, the French call it the first floor. The Americans call that the second floor.
Yes.
I think we pretty well copy the Americans on that one.
Smart. No, it's not.
No, definitely not smart. Not these days, anyway.
Not these days, no.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the children's section used to be on the first floor, but it was so impossible with people coming with their strollers. And anyway, so if people visit the shop today who haven't been here in 10 years, it is... Yeah, it's growing.
Yeah.
Sort of octopus climbing up through the interior of the building.
Before I forget, you did reference the Tumbleweeds.
Mm-hmm.
Better talk a little bit about what that means.
Okay, so since the shop first opened, George has invited people to stay for free in the bookstore, which I mentioned before. And since then, we estimate 30,000 people have stayed in the shop. And George called these people Tumbleweeds because he said they blew in and out on the winds of chance. So people who stay in the shop, it's not always, but they tend to be younger people in the early, mid-20s, sometimes their early 30s. Occasionally there's a much older tumbleweed, but usually it's younger folks. Right now, I think
writers.
Wannabe
writers?
Writers, artists.
It's
We
not
call
anyone.
it the Tumbleweed Hotel, but it's
No.
not a hotel. I mean, you can't book in advance.
Yeah.
It's free. The way to stay is just you have to show up and ask to meet Sylvia, or the bookshop manager, whose name is Octavia. And if there's a space, then they'll have a chat with the person who wants to stay. And just really to get a sense of this person and what they plan on working on while they're here. To answer primary, are they trustworthy? Because this person is going to have keys in and out of the bookshop and access to the shop after everyone's gone home at night. It's not like Sylvia and David live here or there are any other staff members who live here. So it's a tradition that, really started when the shop first opened. George letting people crash here, and, that really went through the 60s and these hippie times into the 70s where there was like a real commune vibe both in Paris and lots of places around the world. Into the 80s when air travel became, just more and more relatively affordable, and you had ever more backpackers. Into the 90s when at that point George was in his late 80s, and I think the Tumbleweeds really had the run of the place. There could be as many as 25 at a time, and I think it was a lively atmosphere, lots of quote-unquote romance and good times. But since Sylvia has taken over, it's a little more serious-minded. It's no more than 6 people.
Better organized.
Yeah, better organized. No more than 6 people at a time. And the Tumbleweeds help out around the shop, but I think some people think that that's who works at the shop. But really, they aren't the employees. There's really experienced booksellers who work now at Shakespeare and Company. And the Tumbleweeds are here having their own experience, maybe learning about running a shop, but they're not the ones who are working here behind the till.
Anything else about the shop that you think the world should know about that they don't already?
I'll just say a couple things that I just really appreciate about the shop. I came here, I'd been an editor in the States, and I had left my job just looking
at
Zoetrope. Yeah, so I'd been there quite
cool
a long
magazine.
time. It's a great magazine. I mean, it was a real thrill to be there, and we were a very small staff. It was myself, really one other editor, Michael Ray, and we worked,
Where is that located?
in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of autonomy and really just reported directly to Francis Coppola. So it was a really wonderful, unusual, artistic experience, for a paid gig, really lucky, the kind of thing that, there's not a ton of jobs like that out in the world.
Yeah.
So it was a really, really tough to leave because I thought, I'll never have something like this again. And I won't in some ways. But I'm sorry, I just totally distracted myself, being like, it's great days at Zoetrope. Sorry, I'm going to have to cut this because I'm like, where was I going with that?
No, I'm not going to cut that. That's good stuff.
No, you can keep that, but you'll have to cut out this, But so I'd left Zoetrope and had come to Paris, and so I left, that's what I wanted to say. So I left that, and it was kind of this leap of faith of leaving something that I loved, but I'd been working...
Takes courage to do that.
But I'd been at the company since I was 25, and I was then 27 or 37 and feeling like, am I going to be here forever? And it's like, well, I could be, and I'd be happy, but it's not what I'm going to do. No, I want to have these just try other things. And so I'd just come to Paris on vacation, and for a long vacation, 6 weeks, and I'd met Sylvia and offered to volunteer around the shop, and that led to me helping somebody else kind of start creating a template for how you can start organizing this information about the shop's history and just start the research process, which then turned into contract work, which then turned into my being here full time. And the reason I tell this long thing is just to say, I came to Paris and I didn't know anyone. And the shop for me, and this is what I would hope people know, like, it's still such an alive place of the heart. You know, it's become famous and ever more famous, and you can come here and there'll be a lot of people around, but the heart of it and what it's trying to do, both for writers and for readers and for young aspiring writers, for people like me.
Should mention there's also a great reading series, or a great
incredible
lineup
event series.
Yeah, it seems like all the great best writers of today are wanting to come here.
Yeah, they've just done a really great job. We had Nicole Krauss was here last night. Rebecca Solnit is here on Tuesday. Bruce Handy later in the week. Really, every week we're just so lucky to have great writers coming through. And again, like, all these events take place in the bookshop. They're free. Everyone's invited. Anyone's welcome.
Yeah, and if it's full inside, you spill out onto the little patio outside, and right.
Yeah, and we've put speakers outside so people can listen. In the winter, we have in the upstairs we have a screen so people can go upstairs and watch video of the event, because the bookshop space is small, so we can't fit hundreds of people into the one room with the author. But
this is where they
tuck everybody around.
Ethan Hawke filmed that.
Yeah, Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy in Before Sunset.
Yeah, okay.
Before Sunset.
Yeah.
But
sorry, but I interrupted you talking about your heart. So
no, it's okay.
Was,
but I just want to say, like,
hope I didn't break your heart.
No, it's okay.
No, okay.
That's intact.
So
it's tough. I'm a toughie.
Okay, let's continue with the heart.
Yes, so I thought myself, like, as this kind of wanderer, really found a home here, and you know, a place that absolutely welcomed me in, and now introduced me to everybody who's in my life. And I'm not an unusual person that way. You earlier were talking to the Tumbleweeds, and I think you can get that sense of how special it is for them to be here, and how a part of things and the arts and literary world one feels here.
Well, it's so cool, as you say, you've got these great authors coming by, and often they'll stay overnight here, and these young kids get to meet some big name authors, right?
Yeah.
And just hang out with them. That's pretty exciting.
I think that's exciting, and I think there's that, and I think in addition to it, there's also just the staff and different people around here that are so encouraging. It's just not a cynical space, which it's not to say other places are, but it's just lovely that this one isn't. Like, all these young people who are staying here, it's like you want them to succeed and you want to encourage them. And
well, it's great to be around young, non-cynical, hopeful.
Yeah. And it keeps, I think, for all of us who work here, like, there's a youthful vibe in the shop, and that's because there are these, like, very hopeful, youthful people who are here. So I'd say that about the shop, and I just really respect what Sylvia and David have done with the shop in balancing what is a growing interest in the bookstore with also keeping, you know, all the upstairs, for the most part, the books aren't for sale. It just is a place for people to come and read and hang out and pet the cat and play the piano, and still having the Tumbleweed program.
Although, there's a lot of traffic here, so hanging out and reading is
well, I was going to say, this would be my last thing to say. If people are interested in coming into the shop and really appreciating it, the thing to do is come anytime during the winter. I mean, there are nights that I've gone down. I tend to come in later and stay later. There are nights that I go down at 8 o'clock and there's, like, no one in the bookshop in the winter. I mean, it's just as charming and cozy as you can possibly imagine. But if one has to come in the summer, you know, during the week after, like, 6 or 7 p.m. is really a time that somebody can come and really enjoy the shop in their own way and not feel like there's so many other people around.
Thank you for sharing with us your experience of Shakespeare and Company and the history of the shop and the people behind it. It was lovely to listen to you talk.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me and for asking the shop to be with you. It's really great.
So let's quickly plug the book again. How can people get their hands on this book and buy it?
Again, if you're in Paris, come to Shakespeare and Company,
Okay.
or it's on our website. Otherwise, it is in bookshops. It's in lots of independent bookshops, and it is online at bigger e-retailers if you are inclined that way.
We're not, but some people are, I guess.
Some people are.
I've been speaking with Krista Halverson, who, maybe you could tell me exactly what you do here.
I'm now the publishing director. So we have other publishing projects that we're starting, not all related to Shakespeare and Company. So I'm overseeing those projects.
So you're not a one-author...
No, I mean, I do like to joke that I was hired as the publishing director and then I hired myself to do the first book. So it's like the greatest act of nepotism in publishing history, and I'm quite proud of myself for pulling it off.
Okay.
But that did actually happen the other way.
What are you planning?
There's two things I'm primarily working on right now. One, and something else, I did hire myself to do another project, and I'm editing a collection of poetry around a theme, which I won't say now, because people are on, the edges of their seats for new poetry collections.
Oh,
so
yeah,
don't want to spoil the surprise.
Well, unless you're Rupi Kaur, then you're...
Yeah.
But, okay.
Yeah. So it's a collection of poetry. And then, I don't know if I can say this. Again, these things it's such a small world of what we're doing. But also, I'll just say we're partnering with a bigger publisher to bring out a classic reprint of a bestseller here in the shop.
Okay.
When you turn your recorder off, I'll let you guess, and if you get it in 3 tries, you can have something free at the cafe.
All right. Okay. I'm licking my chops right now. Thanks so much again,
Yeah,
Krista.
thank you.
Okay.